So today's talk is on despair. And I think normally my topics are, either neutral topics or happy topics or how do we get rid of this or not dive into that. And despair, even when I wrote it into the schedule and I put it out there, I was like, ooh, this might be a really serious talk. And I want to preface that it doesn't have to be. We look at topics like this of despair, and especially if you've had moments in your life where things were really challenging and you were feeling that feeling of despair, you might think, when we look at it, we have to get really serious and put our work face on and be like, oh, what do I do with this? You don't. You can still be happy. We can still be jolly. We can be in the heart. And I like to think that the heart, it's not that it's always positive, but it's neutral. It looks at things as they are, and it finds wisdom in whatever it is. And that's the idea today. That's the intention. And so as we look at despair, there'll be both sides. There'll be all of the spectrum. For me, when I think of despair, one of the first things that comes up is, it's a feeling, but where's the feeling coming from? What's the mindset that's triggering the sensation in our body of despair? And I was thinking about it this morning in my meditation, and what came through was, there's moments where we feel helpless, or maybe we feel hopeless because of a situation, because of a mindset, because of whatever might be going on. And in that moment, a feeling starts to come up, and it's maybe a heaviness, or maybe just this sense of, closing in, contraction. And I think that's what we point at and say, despair. This is a sense of despair. But because it's only a feeling, we can start to work with it because we can look and backtrack and look and see, okay, where was the trigger? What was the mindset? How did I respond to something outside of me or a situation that starts to allow me to look at this differently? Because like I said, I think it's triggered by the mindset of hopelessness or helplessness, which, by the way, is two of the core beliefs or core fears that most people have. There's four really core common beliefs and fears that people have. Hopelessness, helplessness, unlovability, and unworthiness. Right? How many of you can relate to at least one of those, if not a few more? Yeah. And it's because it's part of our human nature. We have a hard wiring of certain things because it's also part of how we survived. Right? We want to be loved. We want to be worthy. We want to have hope. We want to feel like we can do something towards a situation. Otherwise, we would just kind of sit and let dangers and threats come and kill us. But with those underlying motivations, it allows us to actually survive and evolve throughout, the span of time. But at some point, your survival isn't a necessity so much as a priority anymore. Like right now, you guys are all sitting in a heart talk in Bali, Indonesia, listening to a guy you've never seen before, just impromptu a talk. You probably aren't worried about your physical dangers and threats and things like that. You're like, no, I'm good with survival right now. That means you have the luxury to stop focusing on that and instead start looking at, how do I enjoy my life? How do I start to process some of the shadows and things like that have been holding me back and creating a cloud within my mind of despair? Because again, I think despair is simply this barricade. It's like something right in between what could be hopeful, what could be possibility, what is potential. But we find ourselves here in a focused place that we're not seeing that. We're limiting our view and the possibilities of our own lives. This happens a lot. And again, it's an evolutionary thing, right? When we were evolving as human beings, and actually all animals pretty much, when there is danger, your nervous system does something. It goes, focus. And it gets really focused on whatever the danger is so that you can react or respond to it adequately, right? You wouldn't want to be standing in the middle of the road, semi-truck's coming at you, and you're like, look at the butterfly. You don't want to be distracted. You want to know what's going on. And so your biology has actually created this mechanism to get you really focused. And what I found in my own personal experience and also working with a lot of clients and students and just reading a lot of different books around the subject is that the problem around our survival mechanisms, the anxieties that we have, the fears that come up, the feelings like despair, is that when a moment came in your life that caused you to react defensively or to create protection, and maybe it was needed in that moment, you never took the wall down. You didn't bring the shield away. You kept it up and you kept walking. And this is where the problem begins, because suddenly we're walking with so much armor and we've built so many walls that we've barricaded ourselves in. We blocked all the other possibilities that might have been out there. It's kind of like how many of you have either on your phone or on your laptops, at some point you decide you're going to clean it, and it's been maybe months or years that you've actually wiped this thing, and you do it and you're like, whoa, my display is so clear. I didn't realize. Because it had gotten so dirty after so much time of accumulating layers that you didn't realize the perfection of clarity that was actually there, the possibility of seeing things that you didn't see before, and I think it's the same in life. Different feelings, different fears, different experiences and traumas that start to layer upon layer build this dust, this barrier to what's real in life. And then on the inside, looking out into this kind of opaque milkiness of lack of clarity, we start thinking there's no possibility. We start feeling hopeless and helpless. And that's when despair comes up. Which actually makes me wonder if despair is actually always a projection of something. Because if you really look at where you're at directly and just see it neutrally, like you were a security camera looking at the situation, I don't think despair could come. Curiosity maybe, because you're analyzing what's there. But despair is when you start to think, maybe this situation's going to be how it is forever. You guys ever felt that? You're in a situation, yeah, right? You've been in a situation and maybe it's a really challenging one or just not something you like or it's uncomfortable. Even if it's a yoga posture in one of these classes, you're like, how much longer? Right? And you start thinking, they're not going to let us out of this. The reality, the world, God, whatever you want to call it, the universe is keeping me stuck in this. The truth is your own mind and mindset and blocks and shields and defenses that may not be necessary anymore, they're keeping you there. But when you're feeling that stuckness and you think it's going to be forever, of course you're going to have despair. Because that's the very definition of hopelessness. You're like, well, it's never going to change. How many of you have said that comment, either in your head or out loud? Well, it's always going to be that way. That's how I am. Or something like this, right? But that's never the truth because we're constantly changing, whether we like it or not. And our environment is constantly changing. The trick is to realize you can direct some of it. You can actually start to bring your focus not towards what you think is stuck, but towards what you think could be dynamic. What could change? What are the possibilities and potentials? And when you bring your focus there, suddenly they start to appear. It's this beautiful aspect of the mind, the reticular activating system, I think is what it's called, the RAS. What you focus on, what you make significant is what's going to show up more for you. Right? You've probably heard it in more metaphysical or esoteric terms that, where your focus is what you manifest, and how you create in the world is by thinking and affirming things and stuff like that. That's all because of the mechanism of your mind. It's like a Google search engine. If you tell it, look for happiness, it will look for happiness. But if unconsciously you're constantly telling it, look for dangers, look for things where things aren't working out, look for failure, look for where this and that person didn't support me, or look for that or whatever, it's going to keep looking for those things because that's the command of focus that you gave it. And so as we start to play with this idea of despair, maybe we start to also look at how do we move from it as a position of limited thinking to a possibility of infinite potential and actually start opening to those potentials. Can I share a little story? Love telling stories. It's funny, with my clients, I'm always like, look, those are just stories. You need to let those go. Here's some new ones. So this is not one of my own stories. This is an ancient story. It's about Gautama Sakyas, the original Buddha. And when the original Buddha, many of the prophets of old, he has a certain history to him and legends. And his legend was that he sat down after trying many different things and realizing this isn't working, that's not working. He's like, screw it. I'm just going to sit down under this date tree and I'm just going to meditate and see what happens. And as he did, he started to move through the sensations of his body. He started to move through the thoughts within his mind. And it's said in the legend that Mara, the evil one, comes down and decides, no, you're getting too close to enlightenment. We don't like this. You're going to screw this up for us. Look, and first they tried pleasure as a distraction. So Mara sent his daughters, these like spiritual belly dancers, and they're all in front of the Buddha, and he's sitting there, he's meditating, and he opens his eyes for a moment, acknowledges them, and then closes his eyes back and stays focused, concentrating, doing his practice. So Mara's like, shoot, pleasure didn't work. Okay, pain will work. It's always either pleasure or pain. So he starts throwing fire and brimstone, and as it comes into the aura of the Buddha, turns into these flower petals, just falls to the ground. You can imagine at this point the evil one, Mata, is like, son of a god! All right. And then he does one last trick, and he says to Gautama Sakyas, he says to him, okay, look, you've got me beat. You're going to become enlightened. You're going to understand all of it, but you will be alone because nobody else will get it. You'll be by yourself. This one got him a little bit. He was sitting there, he was having this joyful experience, and he goes, because it is human nature, we want to connect, right? And he's feeling despair. And eventually he meditates for another 10 days or so. And eventually he answers back and he goes, you're right. But even if just one person understands, or if none, if it's just me, that's enough. And he wakes up and that's his enlightenment, and he begins to walk and teach and share. And what I like about that story is really this idea that, pain and pleasure, these are such strong forces in our world, but the limitation and the feeling of despair, that's the one that can knock us off our course. If we don't realize that where we're at is already enough. Every single moment, every single time, no matter what the challenge or circumstance or situation is, where you're at is enough. It doesn't mean it can't get better. Of course it can get better. Always. But it's enough. And the reason I think this is so important is because if you're trying to fill up a cup and you think the cup is never full enough, you will never find satisfaction. You'll never find contentment. You'll always feel helpless in it because it's like there's a leak, which is your thoughts most of the time, and limiting beliefs and fears and insecurities and all these things that come up. Those are the cracks in the cup. You're pouring life into it, experiences. You're doing so much investing in your lives, and it's just pouring out. Of course, you're going to feel desperate because it seems like nothing's working. But what would happen if you suddenly just said, you know what? There's enough in the cup. There's enough for me to simply say, I'm not missing anything. I'm not lacking anything. And when you do that, and also there's nothing wrong with me, right? There's a balance of shadow and light and all sorts of different things and stuff within us, but there's nothing wrong. And when you start to realize that, suddenly your cup stops emptying, and now you can just be filling it to fill it and let it start overflowing into abundance. But you have to realize this is enough. I was having a great conversation a few days ago with this gentleman who used to be in, I think, an investment firm. And the firm was worth billions. He's a millionaire. But he was burnt out with all the corporate stuff. He came here to Bali, and he's living kind of a different life now. And I asked him, what was it that helped you shift and realize you needed balance, you needed to do something else, that this wasn't working anymore? And he said, when I asked myself the question, when is it enough? When I asked myself the question, when is it enough? Because before that, he was desperate to keep moving, keep rising, keep competing, because he was always comparing. And when we compare, we're never going to be enough, because there's always going to be some who have more or are doing more or you think are having a better life, and there's always going to be ones that are less than, based on what your perspective of that is. But the truth is that every single person is living their life exactly perfectly where they're at, and that you don't need to compare against them with yourself. I like to think of us each as vessels, and as vessels or containers, we're like this cup of water here. And some of us will have a smaller cup, some of us will be a big cup, some will be like a jug, some will be a little pint thing. And each one of them is beautiful and perfect and is what it is. And a full cup is a full cup, doesn't matter which container. Do you guys get what I mean? A full cup is a full cup no matter what the container. If this one's full, it's full. If that water bottle is full, it's full. Full is full. But if I go, I think that water bottle holds more, and it's bigger than this one, and even though this cup was full before I looked over there, now I'm not enough. You see how comparison takes us right off the path of our own truth and our own contentment. And when we do that, that's where we start to feel despair. Because we're now judging where we're at instead of building from it. Gratitude being a way that we shift our focus. But how do we shift our focus if we've always been, or we've been dwelling or marinating, that word's great, marinating in a certain feeling? How do we get ourselves out when we probably think that's it? There's no other possibilities. I think the first thing is to simply give yourself the possibility of a possibility, right? A lot of times I'll get clients that come in and they'll say, I want to do this and this, but I can't because of blah, 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 blah. And they have their reasons and their excuses and their explanations. And some of the time, the reasons are true, right? It might be, I don't have this skill, so we'll go learn the skill, right? But they let themselves get stuck. And the thing I always tell them is, take the first step. And they're like, yeah, but I can't. Why not? Well, because of this, and I go, no, the reason is because you're not giving yourself permission. Give yourself permission, regardless of what you think is possible, regardless of whether you think you're capable, just give yourself permission. Because until you do that, you have a anchor weighed down on your own body and your own ability to go forward. You have to unbuckle it and literally say, I am worthy of this. There is a possibility this could happen. Not a certainty. See, that's where we get into despair again. Because we want a guarantee. We don't want to shift, let's say, for instance, quit our job until we've found the next perfect job. And that's why I always applaud those who jump ship, even if they don't have the next landing point. They're trusting in life and in themselves, and mostly in a possibility. And that possibility can't come until you make the space for it. That's the crux of it. That as long as we're waiting for a better solution, for the fix, then we're not going to make a move. And until we make that move, or at least release something out of the space that we're in, especially the mentality of it, we have no space to receive any new possibility. So it will take discipline, consistency, and courage. It takes courage. Because you have to take a risk. When you're in despair, it seems like nothing is possible. And to say, wait, you want me to step out even more out of my comfort zone? I'm so familiar with my despair. At least I have that going for me. And you want me to step out of that? Yes. Why? Well, are you happy there? No. Is it possible you could be happy out there? Maybe, but it could get worse too. Yeah, that's the risk. And I like to say that in every gamble, there's a 50-50 if you take a step. If you don't take any step, you have 100% staying exactly where you're at. So if you're not happy where you're at, if you're feeling despair, or you're feeling any challenge where you're at, or even just a contraction that you haven't been growing, take the risk, because you have 50% more chance of a new possibility of something. And when you do that, that little bit of blue sky starts. Because you step out and you're like, oh, okay, one, I didn't die. Right? Because the mind is going to try to protect you. It's like, don't change anything. We've been living all this time, doing the same thing, feeling the same way. Don't change it. But the mind is limited in that because it's reflective. It's only looking backwards. You got to use your heart and your imagination to move forward. And you take that little step and then the mind calms down a little. It's like, okay, we took a little step, still alive. Okay. And then something starts to bubble up and it's possibility. Right? I'll tell you guys another little story. I used to have a healing center and a residential center in San Diego, California. And what I used to do is I would put ads out to let people know that they could come and live there, and for free, they paid a rent for the living, but for free they would get this program and guidance and coaching and all these opportunities to just move through whatever they were moving through. And in order to get that, though, they had to show me that they were really ready for it, that they were in a point in their life that they really want to change. And so I would get like 100, 200 responses whenever I would put an ad. I would be like on Craigslist or these, classifieds. And I would start going through them, and I'd find the ones that fit kind of the demographic and the people I wanted there and that, I knew weren't going to cause more trouble than good. And I would respond to them and say, look, I'd be happy to have you come. Please share with me what your story is. And I mean, the stories they would share were amazing, just the struggles and the challenges and things they were going through. And this was their last bit of hope. They were like, maybe this can help. And I would respond and simply saying, after I would do like a little interview process, and I'd say, look, I would love for you to come and live here and to experience this. And let's say I would send that out to 10 people. And my center only held maybe 5. Because I knew already that half of those people, if not more, most of the time it was like 8 out of the 10 people. After a couple weeks, they would respond to me and they say, thank you so much for this opportunity. You don't know how much it meant to me. But the weirdest thing happened. Right after I got that, I got this job opportunity. And right after that, I found the love of my life. And then this happened and this happened. My world is turning around. And it wasn't because they had to go and change anything. They had to believe change was possible. And that's what that opportunity saying, hey, why don't you come and live here? That's what it gave them. The little bit of nudge to believe it was possible. And I think a lot of times that's what we need when we're feeling despair, is to let ourselves know two things. One, that we're worthy of something more, something better in our lives. Whatever it is that you want. And better doesn't mean a hierarchy of like it's better than another. It means more aligned for you. That's always possible for you. And the other thing to realize is you're the one who gets to give yourself permission first. If you're waiting for somebody else outside of you to do it, I mean, I did it in those circumstances, but it was really them who gave themselves permission to reach out. And so that's often the biggest thing. It's also why, especially in mental health work, people who have despair, the biggest step is that they just ask for help. In so doing, they're already admitting to themselves there's possibility that this could get better. I love an example that I think it's from Tony Robbins, that a client of his called him one day, like at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. in the morning. They were desperate and they were literally at that suicidal point. And they're crying and emotional. And they get on the phone and Tony's like, hello? And because it's 4 a.m. in the morning. And this person's like, Tony, I don't know what to do. I think I'm about to kill myself. Like, this and that. Everything's going wrong and it's hopeless. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And Tony's response, he goes, Okay, I'll tell you what. Can you call me back at 9 so I can get a full night's rest and then we'll talk then, okay? Person's like, what? What do you mean? Well, look, the same person that got you to get the phone right now, the person inside you that knew that there was a possibility I might be able to help, they'll still be there at 9 a.m., right? So just call me back at 9. And I love that because he pointed out, he's like, there was a piece of you that still had hope. So even in the deepest despair, there's always a piece that's still going like, this could change. This could change. I think Eckhart Tolle had a similar thing. He was on his that point also of suicide, and he says to himself, he's like, that's it. I can't live this way anymore. And then he realized, he's like, wait, who is it that I'm talking about, that I'm saying I can't live this way? Because I'm telling myself, but it's I, and that just got him into a whole new thing. He's like, hold on, let me wait on that whole suicide thing and try to figure out what this is. Hope. Sometimes hope comes even just as distraction. We don't want to stay in distraction too long, but long enough to take us away from that reactivity that might be going on. My wife did a wonderful thing to me a few years ago when I was in a really reactive space. I had lost it. I was so angry about something. And we were having breakfast, and we always have oatmeal in the morning, and I like my oatmeal with some pineapple in it. And I was so upset, and I was like, ugh. And she looks at me, and she's like, okay, look, do you want a magic pineapple? And with the sweetest look on her face, she's just like holding this pineapple up on her spoon. And I remember looking and thinking, okay, I know what you're doing. Like, the adult part of me was like, it's not a magic pineapple, it's just a pineapple. Now, but then the inside part of me, the child, the one that's reacting, right? The one that's got all that hard wiring and is functioning off some of these limiting beliefs, it was like, whoa, wait a second. She's talking about a magic pineapple. Shut up, I want to hear what she's got to say. And that part of you is always going to be stronger. See, the part that I think is despair is going to be the conscious mind, which is limited in its perspective, because it only knows what it has experienced. But that infinite part of you, the essence of you, the greatest potential of everything within you, which, by the way, I like to say that the self is your infinite possibilities, who you choose to be, not who you have become because of your past. Those are just choices that ended up bringing you to this place. But rather, what are the choices? And that part, that's this inner peace, and it's infinite. You can choose whoever you want to be. How many of you came traveling here and you didn't know anybody? I think one of you said it right there, right? You showed up, nobody knows you, and you probably had that thought to yourself. You're like, I could be anybody. I could do whatever I want. I could rename myself. A lot of people do that. Spiritual names here are rampant, right? And in so doing, you gave yourself permission of a new possibility. Now, why did you have to travel across the world to do it? Why couldn't you just do it right in the situation that you were in? One possible reason is the situation may not have felt safe. It's a big reason that we don't allow change and why we stay in these places of despair and these limiting beliefs and fears is if we're not feeling safe at our core, at our nervous system, emotionally and mentally. And so maybe the first step is find safety. And it doesn't always need to be that you travel across the world, but just step outside for a moment. Go into your own space or request a container of safety. For anybody who's in a relationship, one of the most powerful things you can do for any communication is instead of just springing something on a partner, ask them, hey, can we take a moment to sit down and talk? Now I know, I even say that. Some of you are like, ooh, those are deadly words. You're like, I hear that. They're like, can we have a talk? Ooh, what did I do? But it doesn't have to be that. If you're going to have a talk, I shared this with my wife, like a couple months ago, that we were talking about this, that if somebody comes to you and says, I'd like to talk, it means they haven't come to any decision yet. They want to talk about it. If they just want to tell you something, they're just going to tell you. And so when people want to communicate, how beautiful can that be? And you can ask for that container. And again, that might be asking for support, for help. It might be just asking to talk through something, a challenge or a problem you've been having. You're trying to figure out another possibility for yourself. There's another place that I find despair comes up a lot, and especially for a lot of people that are on a self-discovery journey and personal development and they're growing. And it's similar to the Buddha story in a way. At some point, as you start to grow and you start to grow out of old habits and you start to grow into new interests and new curiosities, the tendency is that the community and the circles that you've been hanging out with, that maybe you even grew up with, or even your family, or deep friendships, may not align anymore. How many of you have experienced that? Yeah. It's scary, right? There's this moment where you're like, well, but if all this keeps changing, like I'm going to lose my best friend or my family won't understand me. I hear that from people all the time. They've been here in Bali for a few weeks. They have these massive transformational moments. And then they're terrified to go home because they know they won't understand. Or even if you go to a retreat or a training, like we have these experiences that can change us. And then we're afraid because it might also change our environment. That's a given. But the fear isn't because it's going to change, because like I said, that's a given. The fear is this despair that you're losing something. That something is being lost from your life. And yes, there's always, in change, there's two parts. That which you're losing and that which you're gaining. This is really important to realize. When we're focused on, this is the only way. And unfortunately, most of the time that focus is on something we don't even like. Like this was a good example. It was somebody that was supportive and that she liked and she was, had great value in that. But most of the time, the thing we're focused on is the challenge. It's the thing we don't want in our lives. And we're like, that's all there is. All you have to do is do two things. Pause. Because if you pause yourself, your analysis of something, life continues. And all of a sudden, the change just happens before you even know it. But the other thing you can also do is step back. Because if you're too close, if you're like, you're not seeing things clearly, you got to step back. And in stepping back, you start to get a wider view. I like to think of it like a flashlight. If you bring a flashlight really close, it's very focused, right? Very concentrated. But you only see this little bit. And as you start to step back, if it's in a dark room, you start to step back, you start to see things you didn't see before. Those are the opportunities and possibilities that were there in the room with you the whole time. But you were too close to one thing, one idea, one mindset, one possibility. Step back, you start to see more. Take a pause so that you can choose which one you want to make a priority and then start to cultivate it, move towards it. So we're talking about despair, and like everything in life, I think despair is also temporary. It's an interesting thing. I was talking to a client about this the other day, that the things that we're experiencing in life, whether they're happiness or despair or challenge or freedom and ease, we think that they're happening over a span of time, like, oh, this thing, it has been great and I don't want to lose this thing. But the actuality is that in every single moment, every single second, every instance of time, you're choosing how to see that thing. Which means that it came and it went, just like a flame. Right? You look at a candle, and it looks like the flame is there consistently. But if you slow down the footage of it, if you were watching it on a camera, and you watched it, you would see the flame is there, then it's not there, there, then it's not there, there, then it's not there. And that's how life is. Everything is impermanent. It's coming and going, coming and going, coming and going. What makes it look similar, like it's a sequence, is that you keep choosing what you want to have come back. You keep choosing what you're focused on. Both possibilities are there, that it's not there and that it's there. Or that form is there or a different form is there. That it's good, that it's bad, that it's challenging or it's easy. There's always the possibility of either one. They're always in the room. All possibilities. The one you've decided you're focused on is the one that keeps repeating only because you keep choosing it. And when you realize that, and you really get what I'm saying right now, you'll realize that you can change your entire reality in an instant. But then, as we talked about earlier, you have to have discipline and consistency to really start to make that the automatic, natural response. So if you've been looking at life and things have been challenging for a long time, then your automatic subconscious reflex is going to be to keep choosing that negativity. But you start to look at gratitude or possibility and potential, and you're moving your way over towards another possibility and looking at it. And eventually that starts to build and build and build until that becomes the flame of consistency instead of this other one. And it always comes down to choice. And that's what I like, is that even in despair where it seems like it's hopeless, it's only hopeless because you're too close to the thing that you're feeling desperate about. Let me make it really practical and easy example. So despair comes from the same word as desperation, right? And when we think of despair, we drop right into hopelessness and stuff like that. Desperation, when I say that word, what's the feeling in most of you? Yeah, exactly, she stuck her tongue out, right? It's this like, this ickiness, right? Because you probably think of it as somebody else that comes up and is being desperate. You're like, stop it, right? It's like that. It's not a nice energy. It's a taking energy, right? Well, many times I've seen in circles or like after dance or stuff like that where they allow people to make announcements. And you'll see that a couple people will make some announcements, and you kind of start to see everybody gets a little restless. They're like, okay, I'm ready to go. Like, dance was great, but I got this other event, this and that. And then there'll be one or two people. They're like, wait, can I just share? Please, just really quick, can I just share? And then they'll share, but it's like an auctioneer. They're like, I've got an event, I would love it if you guys go to thank you. No value, nothing conveyed, no communication, because they came from desperation. They were just feeling like, if I could just get it in there really quick. When we have hope, and hope comes from moving towards something, towards a potential, towards a possibility, towards amazing love, when we have that, then we're not in a rush. When we're trying to avoid a situation that we're really focused on, and let's say again it's despair or some other negative feeling or discomfort, and we're like, I just want to get out of this, if I can just get out of this. Then we rush things, we're too urgent, we're desperate to get away. And you can spot it in yourself and others very easily that way. So maybe a question you can ask yourself if you're ever feeling despair, or you have a friend that is, and you want to help them, just ask them to ask themselves this. What do you want? What do you want in life? And I can guarantee almost that they're going to answer like this, especially if they're in despair. They'll be like, I don't want to suffer anymore. I don't want this challenge. I don't want to live like this anymore. Okay, that's what you don't want. What do you want? It's a different question. What do you want? It's a question I think most people haven't really ever asked themselves. They're so busy trying to fix the situations that they don't want and putting all their energy and investment and cultivation into the seeds of despair and disparity that they're not actually going, oh, wait, I want these things in my life. Let me cultivate that instead. And that would be, again, the gratitude element, right? You cultivate what you want to keep seeing in your life. Most of the time what I've found is that while people will say they don't know what they want, what the truth is that they don't realize they have permission to have what they want. They don't have permission to have what they want. And they're waiting for that permission to be given to them by some external situation or approval or validation or acknowledgement. The problem with that is in that you're not in control. You don't have the certainty of knowing how somebody else is going to respond to you, which means you're going to end up feeling a little helpless. But you have the permission to give it to yourself.
What is despair and depression?
Ooh, good question. So she's asking, what's the difference between despair and depression? Despair, as we're kind of defining it today in this talk, feels like it's this place where we're feeling hopeless about something. Depression, I believe, and this is just my own philosophy and experience with it, is when we have been repressing and pushing down our emotions for so long that it becomes depression, right? And now it's this accumulated pile of crap normally, because the emotions that we push down are normally the ones that are the negative ones. Or even if they're the happy ones, and we've been told we're not allowed to be happy, maybe some circumstance in your life you're not supposed to be joyful, and you've been pushing it down, pushing it down, pushing it down, and eventually so much of your energy is in holding that emotion. Emotions are so powerful. In holding it down, like you're holding a beach ball underwater, and you're like, that you become exhausted at the surface and in yourself. And this is why when you look at somebody who's depressed, they always seem exhausted. They're tired. They've had enough. They can't do it anymore, but they don't realize what they're doing. It's not that they're dealing with, they're perpetuating a circumstance by not letting it come up. It's a great question. And that's another one that we can look at in terms of despair or depression or any of these things that we're holding on to. What would happen if we allowed it to come up? If we allowed the emotion to express? If we gave ourselves the safety of a space to do so? There's a lot of different events and practices that we have here in Bali that allow for just that. You can go to a kirtan, just shout out everything in your heart. I've wept at some kirtans, just whoa, stuff coming up. Or cacao ceremony, that'll take you to ecstasy and happiness like no other. There's ways that we can start to move these things. And one emotion that I found is probably one that most people are very afraid to allow. And it's actually often the one that's right on top of depression or despair. It especially comes out of helplessness. It's anger. Any of you dealt with some anger in your lives? And the thing with anger is because it can be volatile, it can be destructive, it can be dangerous. We're afraid of it then. And so we push it down. If you've done any kind of study into emotional therapy and things like that, we always find that, anger is here, and then normally below it is this reservoir of sadness, grief, despair, depression, all this other stuff. The anger, which is this super powerful force, I like to think of it as the two hands that are holding the beach ball, right? Takes so much energy, and it almost takes the energy to be like, why did this happen? And you're holding it down with all that energy. To let the anger up. I'm going to share something that came up with a client just recently as I was having a conversation with them, that what if anger could come and go really quickly? What if anger was like the steam on a boiling pot of water? See, we often think that anger is going to last a long time. It doesn't if we let it just go, and then we immediately go down into what else is there. I see it all the time. If I'm working with a client and, they've got all this stuff and I see the resistance, the friction, and that seems like it's the anger. But when they finally, just for even a second, go, and then break into tears. Because the actual anger is very little. I think the actual anger, well done, Lawrence. Right on time, we planned this. The actual anger or the barrier is your resistance to living, your resistance to feeling life in whatever form it wants to come in. When you start to allow it and you start to let that flow through you, and then with that you start to bring your focus towards the things you really want in life, all of a sudden all that energy, instead of being used to suppress something, gets used to create something in your life, to cultivate and develop the very things that you want and dream of and can be content and fulfilled with. How do you deal with despair, with things that are completely out of your control or seem completely out of your control? And you were sharing the example of climate change and environmental things and things like this and the way human beings are treating our planet and each other. And of course, we look at that and we look at the grand scale and immediately we start feeling like we have less and less significance in it, less and less possibility to make any change, and we're eventually feeling helpless. there was something I actually shared at the beginning of the pandemic a few years back, and it was that evolution happens by the minority, not the majority. It's a really important concept, that evolution happens by the minority, not the majority. When we're trying to change the majority, the masses, the systems that are set and have been so for many, many years, we're going to feel helpless. It'll feel like there's very little we can do. But if as a minority, as an individual, you just start to change how you're doing stuff in your own life. And then that might change another, and that might change another. And little by little, those changes and those mindsets and those new practices and ways of doing things will survive. Notice I'm not saying they will overtake the other one. They will survive while the other one will collapse. That's evolution, right? Now, it may not happen in your own lifetime. It may not happen in a couple generations. But the idea is work with where you're at, with yourself, with your community, with like-minded individuals. Let that be the minority that survives the test of time into an adaptation that is better in balance. You're welcome. Now, that said, we also get to have hope that even the little things that we do could have a beautiful butterfly effect. And instead of trying to change the whole thing, which could be very difficult, sometimes imagine like in a grocery store, and if you have, a whole big display of fruit, how they do it and they stack it up and they do this whole big thing. You guys ever felt like just going and just grabbing that bottom fruit, being like, Now imagine that you're the clerk and you're the person who has to maybe clear it all out every evening and they pack it and put it in the fridge or something. I don't know if they do this, but imagine you have to do that and you're like, 1, 2, 3. And you're going to feel a bit helpless and you're like, God, I do this every single day, the same thing every time. Or you come, you put a big funnel right at the bottom and you just pull out one fruit. Because sometimes one element, one individual can make a huge difference cascading through the rest. And the caveat that I'm going to put to that is when that one individual is doing it because it's the truth for them, not because they're trying to make it the truth for others. When you try to make it the truth for others as an activist or protesting or fighting against something, you will immediately activate and trigger the resistance and the nervous systems of everybody else. Do it for yourself, and that creates curiosity. That creates an example, and people will follow it. I'm going to summarize as best as I can what we've been talking about today. Our topic today for this Heart Talk was on despair. And we started to look at it as a feeling that maybe has its roots in a feeling of being helpless, hopeless. But then we started to realize that actually any time we feel helpless or hopeless, it's only because we've limited our perspective, our view of all the potential possibilities that are there because we're too close, too focused, too concentrated on only one element, one place, one possibility. And all we have to do is pause and take a step back, get a wider view, and suddenly we see more possibilities. And our despair starts to lift a little. Step back even further, more possibilities. So many possibilities at some point that you can choose which one you want to prioritize. And guess what? All of them will work towards your benefit and everything else. They all lead to the same place. But sometimes you have to go from one thing to another path because it changes and shifts in life. When you realize that is possible, that change is happening regardless of what you want, and instead of fighting it, you go with it, you direct it, you move along that path, despair turns into hope. And with discipline and consistency, it turns into what you really want, into desire, into joy, into contentment and happiness. But not to be attached to that, because things will change again. So really it's about recognizing that things are always changing. And when you realize that even in the deepest depths of despair, you know that that too shall pass. Thank you, everybody.